Hello again everybody, my name is John from Living Manuscript, and today we're going to be looking at the process of how I built a floating leg harness for my 14th century suit of armor. The construction of a leg harness might seem sort of basic at first, but obviously there's so much more to it. It's a very nuanced piece of the harness. It's certainly something that you're going to want to pay attention to because your legs just normally support the weight of your body, and when you wear armor you have more weight on them and you can't really feel as much sensory feeling, I guess, I don't know. And so I'm a big fan of understanding why armor is the shape that it is. Obviously knowing how to move the steel into that shape is equally as important, but you really need to know both in order to make very nice armor, or at least proper armor, I suppose. One way that I like to figure out how to move this steel into the shapes and what shapes I need to achieve and everything is by making a list of constraints that might be similar to things that armorers and fighters in the 14th century, specifically in this case, would need to fulfill. Things that the armor had to do, places where injury is unacceptable, places where movement is required. Just that sort of thing. And so my thinking is that if I can nail down a list of where the armor needs to be, how it needs to be shaped, and that sort of thing, I can get that much closer to building a piece of armor that is as close to how the originals would have worked contemporarily, which is the goal, obviously. Robert McPherson, who is a very very accomplished armorer, gave a few lectures about this several years ago, which are on YouTube. I put a link in the description. Check them out because they are fantastic. I know that I've taken a few pointers from these lectures, and I think that you could too as well. All of us could, really, I think. But without any further ado, let's move on to the aforementioned list of constraints, so that way we know what we need to achieve.
1. The front is the most important part. Based on the distribution of other armor components like breastplates and other torso protection from the 1350s, it seems that the front of the body was prioritized. Indeed, Robert McPherson details this in the statement.
A kind of an order in which surfaces need to be covered. Frontal surfaces need to be covered before back surfaces, which is to say ventral before dorsal surfaces.
2. The leg harness should not rest on the foot. Ian Lespina spoke about this in his video about greaves, but the long and short of it is that the leg harness shouldn't rest on top of the foot because not only is that uncomfortable with the steel digging into the skin, or top of the foot, shoe, whatever, but it is tiring when the whole harness needs to be lifted when the foot moves up, which is no good. It also doesn't look as sharp, but that's just my opinion. 3. There should be no gapping as the leg bends. This is just sort of a good principle to follow in armoring in general, but essentially all that it means is that if I bend my leg at my knee, the pot lane should move to accommodate the movement, therefore presenting no gap. 4. The leg harness should follow the profile of the leg closely, especially on the inside. I can't really stress this enough because the main mechanic of your locomotion is your legs moving. They are close together, there's sensitive parts in that area, and if your legs are uncomfortable, then you will be in a world of hurt. If that explanation wasn't enough, then just look at the historical examples, from the earliest leg armor to perhaps the pinnacle of it. The armor seemed tended to stick close to the figure. Naturally, there are stylistic differences, but that mechanic stayed true. Now that we've got that covered, let's look at some legs. You'll notice that the front and side, the overall shape is a bit of an inverted cone. There's not really a convenient waist to rest everything on like the torso, but there are still a few spots we can use to our advantage, nearly the bottom and the calf. Though we will still use the waist to our advantage, as you'll see. So going from the top down, the waist and bottom sort of act in unison, as I'll be using the armor girdle or lendiner as described by Ian Lespina once again. Essentially, that works as a separate garment that is smallest around the waist and gets wider toward the bottom, making it unable to slide down. As you can see, the top edge is on the true waist, and the bottom edge, where the leg harness will attach, ends right at my hip joint in the front. This way, As opposed to using a belt and long metal ties, the harness will not slip down if I bend over. You can see the comparison here. The next point where we can distribute weight is the calf. Since this is a floating leg harness, the calf will really only support the weight of the greave and maybe part of the knee, in opposition to an articulated leg harness where all the pieces are connected by rivets. The calf can support the weight of the armor from the knee below as well as above it. So those are the logistics of building the leg harness. Now let's actually build the thing. So making sure to meet all of our constraints, let's start from the top down. And in fact, before you make any plate components, you should really build an arming girdle or something similar first. I've linked a great article as well as this video in the description. In fact, if your gambeson or akatin or arming doublet, whatever, is fitted right, then you could use that alternatively. Once you have your suspension system sorted out, you can start with the thigh armor, or cuisse, as we'll be calling it here. So looking at just your generic thigh, you'll notice that it's not just really a tube. You've got muscles that bulge in different spots and contract in different areas. So neither should your cuisse be just a tube. Now I started with this shape, and yes, I started with a basic tube that was cut at the top to accommodate the way that your hips meet your leg, leaving a little bit of extra room in the groin area for flexibility and other things, which I'm sure you can figure out on your own. But then I shaped it subtly, dishing slightly on the side where the thigh has a lot of muscle on it, but also in the front where the muscle expands quite a bit when you're bending your knee or putting a lot of weight and bending your leg. That way we fulfill the fourth constraint of keeping the armor close to the leg, which is good. Then I rolled the top edge and applied a subtle crease down the middle. The rolled edge also prevents blades from sliding up into your hip. Later this would be assisted with stop rib. I should mention that on the Guillaume du Chasteleux effigy there are what seem to be a form of splinted cuisse, but I had already made a pair of splinted cuisses, so I felt like branching out a little bit and made them out of a single plate. Based on sources like Bodley 264 and some other effigies, it seems that plate cuisses were around by the 1350s, so I thought it would be at least acceptable to use them in historical impression. For the knee, I started out with this shape of 16-gauge steel, and I dished it, and as I dished it, I had to pull the sides back out once in a while so I could still get the hammer into the dish. Then I flared the edges a bit, which is how I interpreted the knees on the Guillaume du Chasteleux effigy. And then I put a crease down the middle for the same reasons as before, which is structural integrity. Now the greave is a bit more of a tricky part, and it takes a lot of practice to really master. I don't think that I've quite gotten there before yet, but like before, it should follow the shape of your leg just as much, if not more, than the other components. I started with the shape a little bit like this, but more will be trimmed as it's shaped, so don't really fall in love with that pattern too much right now. So first I made it into a tube shape, just as before, and then I started shaping it so that it would fit my leg properly. And again, this is, you ask different armors, you'll get different answers. Now I used an anti-clastic stake for this, but that's not strictly necessary. As long as you have the edge of an anvil-like object to hit on it, you'll be just fine, I think. It just might take a little bit more technique. But the point of this is to create that flare at the bottom of the greaves to allow for foot movement. I found that on floating leg harnesses, such as mine, the flare at the top isn't necessarily as needed, but that could be different for articulated leg harnesses. Maybe we'll find out. Now that you've got all the components shaped, it's time to put the whole thing together. So here's how I did that on my first try, which is on each side of the harness I made a hole for a rivet. These rivets would hold one strip of leather that would attach all three pieces together, and I did this to both sides. The trouble with this is that the leather I used was way too thin and stretchy, and therefore over time it kind of stretched out and started to make gaps, and perhaps the most egregiously, violates the second constraint that I set, which is that the leg harness should not rest on the top of my foot. As the leather stretched, the greave got closer and closer to my foot, which eventually it came to rest on the top of it, which is no good.
So I fixed this by grinding out those rivets and taking out those leathers and replacing them with a considerably thicker and a less stretchy leather. So now the three parts stick together much closer, and they don't gap, really. Certainly not as bad as before. But most importantly, I don't sound like a kitchen rolling down a hill when I walk, which is very pleasant. So, that's the floating leg harness that I made for my mid-14th century man-at-arms impression. I've been using it for a long time now, and it's worked out pretty well for me. It's very comfortable to wear. In fact, sometimes I barely even notice it. I personally think that it looks pretty close to the effigy that I used as a base, which is good. And most satisfyingly, it meets all the constraints that I set, which makes it protective, comfortable, and, in my opinion, dashingly good-looking. So, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say. Thanks for watching.